This week's lecture, well, I've changed the title slightly, War, Witchcraft and Plague. I see it on the screen, and War and Witchcraft as the advert, but basically 17th century Stirling. Now, the 17th century is very complicated. So don't worry if you don't follow all the dates and the events. Even I'm still piecing things together. Every now and again I have to remind myself. So next slide, please, Ross. Now, I'm actually going to cheat a little bit. I am going to start this with Mary Queen of Scots, so the late 16th century, because you can't understand the 17th century without figuring out that what happens in Mary Queen of Scots, the transition of power, Mary Queen of Scots to James the Sixth, and then, of course, James the First of England. Everything is tied between Scotland as a proxy in an ongoing war between England and France, between religion, Catholicism, Protestantism. Things get very, very complicated. So just to slightly remind you, and these dates are just to indicate the complexity of what's going on, the series of changes. James IV is Catholic with an English wife. James V is Catholic with a French wife. James V's uncle is Henry VIII. Henry VIII has decided to become Protestant, and he wants his nephew to take over. His nephew, James V, dies of the stress involved in all of that. Mary Queen of Scots takes over. She's Catholic. And then she marries the King of France, and her mum is the regent, so Mary of Guise. So we have French Catholic influence reaching its kind of zenith in Scotland. Right, so slide 3, please, Ross. So, of course, Mary Queen of Scots here, and we have the slide on the right as you're looking are the steps behind the library to the city wall. The city wall, of course, is built to stop Henry VIII's troops forcing the infant Mary Queen of Scots to marry. So these are really French Catholic walls to keep out English Protestants, if that makes sense. I'm not being too controversial there. Slide 4, please. Right, slide 4, a bit of text here. So we have two figures. The image in black and white is Knox, and the image in colour is George Buchanan. Now, George Buchanan is a leading kind of intellectual at the Protestant side of these things. He is moving towards Protestantism. He is subject to the kind of pressures of the Inquisition. He's a poet, he's an academic. He is attached to Mary Queen of Scots' household in France. And some of his poetry is well worth reading. What you really want are the kind of scurrilous, scandalous bits that slag people off rather than the praise poetry. But I have one of his small couplets that are in praise of Mary. In Mary shine both nature's work and arts. Nature so formed her high, art is apt, yet both are outshone by her heart and mind. So nature seems crude and high, art inept. Quite dry stuff, I think, but this is incredibly sophisticated, and it reflects how sophisticated the Scottish court has been and the Scottish court in Stirling was to be. Now, all of this starts to go wrong. Mary is implicated in the death of her husband, Darnley. Darnley is, of course, the father of future James VI. We also find, and this leads to her deposition. Buchanan is the main intellectual force behind Mary's deposition, so he's turned his back. He arrives in Scotland with the royal family. He's attached to the royal family in France, but he's a reformer, so he wants change. Now, significantly, Buchanan's works end up being banned by the later Stuarts because he is very much in favour of democracy. He's a Presbyterian, and the absolute monarchy adopted first by James the First of England, and latterly Charles II, Charles I, Charles II, all causes trouble and leads to conflicts with the church, leads to conflicts with the population, with Parliament. So all of these are rather complicated issues. There is clearly some sexism in amongst all of this. We have Knox's The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, which is when there are two Marys on the thrones. We have Mary Queen of Scots in Scotland and Bloody Mary as called in England. Latterly, of course, we have Elizabeth I. Now, things continue to go wrong for Mary Queen of Scots. There is a civil war after her deposition. And in the course of that civil war, outside Mar's Wark in Broad Street, the regent, so Darnley's dad, James VI's granddad, is assassinated with a bullet, probably from his own troops, but Mary gets the blame. So for James VI, his mum, who he never met, well, clearly met, but he has no memory of her because he never saw her again after when she was after he was a child. This plays with him. So he thinks his mum is evil. George Buchanan was his tutor. He's an old man, a staunch Protestant, and used to quite severely beat the young boy. There's a famous line George suggests to, or kind of angrily renounces some obsequious courtiers in James VI's court, and he says, "You may kiss his erse, but I hae sculpt it." And famously, James was trembled at the sight of anybody who resembled his tutor for years to come. So very, very mixed up period, that kind of final 30, 40 years of the 16th century. So could we move to slide 5, please, Ross? Now, James becomes king when he's 1. This is Scotland's first Protestant coronation. This James is behind the King James Bible. He first comes up with this idea when he's the King of Scotland, and only gets to do it when he becomes the King of England. And famously, the reason for this is to have a standardized approach to the Bible, which has been full of erroneous interpretations and mistranslations, etc., etc. But it's fair to say I don't think the King James Bible is any more particularly accurate. For example, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," which will become pertinent, is really "Thou shalt not suffer a poisoner to live." So he's also against tobacco, which is quite interesting. He writes a book fulminating against the evils of tobacco. Slide 6, please, Ross. Now, the other thing about James is he is obsessed with witchcraft. So the kind of woodcut at the bottom is an image from a 17th century scandal sheet, and relates the events of an attempted assassination on the king by a series of witches from North Berwick. The St Andrew's Chapel in North Berwick, which is next to the Sea Life Centre. That's the small white building down at the bottom right. So James is obsessed with witchcraft. He writes a book, Demonology, which you can actually get on Amazon for a couple of quid, a reprint, which is well worth having a look. Famously in Stirling, we have a letter written by James when he's in Linlithgow Palace to the provost of Stirling, demanding that a witch is sent to him for further investigation. And rather chillingly, I'm going to come back to this, the witch in this letter is described as freshly pricked. I'll come back to that. Now, of course, the other thing that happens with James is when he does become King of England, Macbeth is written in his honour, the only Scottish play, and it's clearly all about witchcraft. And if you know the play Macbeth actually, no, not Macbeth, James appears in the play. There is a vision of the number of kings in the Stuart line, and I think, from memory, it has 6 monarchs. It should have 7. Shakespeare deliberately excludes Mary Queen of Scots from the vision, and this is Banquo's vision that the witches show him the number of kings that descend from his line. And famously, of course, James is in that. Right. Now, we're moving forward. Slide 7, please, Ross. The Union of the Crowns in 1603. Now, this, at face value, is an enormous coup for the Scots. We take over England, except it doesn't really work like that. What actually happens is England takes over James, and he made a number of promises to come back to Scotland on a regular basis, but didn't really bother. I think he came back once or twice. So Scotland becomes part of the UK, new country. We gain access to the growing markets in America. Ultimately, the trade with Empire is what has an enormous impact on Scotland's economy. However, in the short term, this has an absolutely disastrous impact on Stirling. So in 1600, Stirling is one of the most important places in Scotland. Just before, generations before, had poetry from Buchanan. We've got Buchanan living in Stirling. We've got the king living in Stirling. He's crowned in Stirling. We have the court poets of his grandfather and great-grandfather, James IV, James V. We've had 200 years of serious royal investment in Stirling. And then all of a sudden, it comes to an end. The money transfers to London. Stirling has been one of the most important places in Scotland, and then it becomes a regional backwater in a bigger Britain. Now, next slide, please, Ross. Now, the money and influence doesn't really turn off. There's still a trickle. So the King's Knot, famously erected either in the last gasps of James VI's reign or to mark the coronation of Charles I. Cowan's Hospital in the 1630s, still a lot of money here. This is obviously the finest and best preserved late medieval hospital in Scotland. Next slide, please, slide 9, Ross. The Chapel Royal is redecorated. Now, this is built by James VI, and it's the final kind of side of the quad. The palace, the old buildings, and the Great Hall. A series of works which span four monarchs: James IV, James V, Mary Queen of Scots, and James VI. Mary Queen of Scots doesn't do very much. This is the first purpose-built Protestant chapel in Scotland. Certainly the first purpose-built royal chapel, Protestant chapel in Scotland. The frieze along the top commemorates Charles I's coronation. Now, slide 10, please, Ross. One of the things that becomes very clear through the 17th century is the money has gone. So you have medieval buildings, you have medieval water supplies, medieval sewerage, and this stays in place really to the 1940s, 1950s, which at the moment, Stirling is certainly arguably the best preserved medieval city in Scotland. And in the 1930s, 1940s, absolutely no question, World Heritage status. Probably we're still World Heritage status at the moment, but the level of clearance was incredible. Now, this clearance, of course, was driven because Stirling had become a slum. A medieval palace is great. A medieval palace in the 1890s, full of families, full of disease, full of inadequate water supply, is dreadful. At the end of the 19th century, Stirling has the lowest life expectancy and highest infant mortality rates of any Scottish city. So inevitably that has to go. Right, now. So next slide, please, Ross, slide 11. Now, what happens in the first half of the 17th century, this is where it all gets a little complicated. We have an ever-increasing absolute monarch. So James I to Charles I. Charles I is more autocratic than James I. So he wants to control the way in which religion is practiced in Scotland. If he wants to control the way religion is practiced across Britain, but there is violent opposition to this in Scotland. This leads to the signing of the National Covenant. And slide 12, please, Ross. And there are obviously there are not lots of covenants in the Bible. This is a biblical phrase. So really, Christ makes covenants in the Bible with the ancient Jews, and what we're really looking at here is that the people have had a reformation in order to have a one-to-one direct relationship with Christ. They don't want the Catholic Church in the middle. Now, the rights and the wrongs of that, I'm not going to go into, but it looks to the people in Scotland that the Charles I wishes to get in the way of that relationship. So we have the National Covenant, and we have armed insurrection, trouble, all sorts of things going on. This ultimately leads to Scottish support for the Cromwellian Revolution. The Cromwellian Revolution obviously leads to the beheading of Charles I, 1649. Now, what happens there is that the Scots take advantage of Charles II. So if we get the next slide, please, Ross. Now, the woodcut here shows a Scot doing rotating a grindstone with a Scottish minister pushing the nose of the young Charles II to the grindstone. Now, this is what's happening here is Charles II is the king. He's crowned in Scotland, and the church demands that he signs the National Covenant and uses this process to get religious freedom for their own church in support for military support. It is sometimes claimed that the minister at the centre holding Charles's nose to the grindstone is James Guthrie. And of course, James Guthrie was a minister in the Church of the Holy Rood, and this is his statue. We'll come back to him. The Smith holds a series of his artifacts. Right, so now what happens is that the Scots invade England, and I am simplifying things here, incredibly simplifying things here. The Scots invade, the English Republicans retaliate and invade Scotland. So if we get the next slide, please, Ross. Now, just a quick series of slides about the defences. Now, these defences around Stirling are put up against Henry VIII's troops, as we've heard, but they're strengthened again against Cromwell's troops. So we have the wall on the southern side, erected in the middle of the 16th century. Then we have the back wall, which is strengthened in the 17th century. And what you're looking at, the bottom slide, so King's Stables Lane is strengthened in the 17th century, running down Irvine Street. And you can actually see some of the walls. So opposite Viewforth Church, there's a 20 feet high wall. This is probably the remains of the wall as constructed against Cromwell. So next slide, please, Ross. Now, this is Port Street, flooded. It gives you an indication of the nature of the defences on the outer defences on the northern side. Traditionally, Stirling had relied upon this area being boggy, so no army could pass. And this is why Port Street floods every now and again. The water hits Castle Rock and spreads everywhere and floods. There is a feature called the stank, or the fosse, or the ditch. If we get slide 16, please, Ross. Now, this feature appears to run under the train station, or close to the train station. This, we think we found the ditch in a couple of places, under Station Road, and also under the Rainbow Slides. We have a section of the ditch here. We think that some of this ditch is shovelled out again against Cromwell. There's an interesting account in the council minutes where the provost tried to get people to shovel out the ditch, and rather than pay them, he offered to buy them some drinks. It's not clear how successful that was, but the ditch was built. Now, the first time Cromwell sees Stirling, he describes it as a well-defended town, and actually doesn't really want to engage. Eventually, however, he does. So if we get slide 17, Ross. So we have the siege by General Monk. General Monk, of course, stayed in Liverland's house, which is Westerland's, currently the nursing home. His command was building, which is currently Darnley's coffee shop. He took the surrender of the castle in the coffee shop. Sorry, did I ask? Sorry, Ross, if I didn't ask you to go to slide 7. We're on slide 17, and what we're looking at are the top left is the service stone in the graveyard, which of course is impacted by musket balls from the siege, Monk's siege of 50-51, and we have impacts on the Church of the Holy Rood, again from the siege. And when you go in the cemetery, have a look for the service stone, and you can imagine a back and forth fire. Now, this is ostensibly between the Church of the Holy Rood and the castle, but actually the musket balls aren't strong enough to do that sort of damage, so there must be troops in the cemetery firing at each other. So if we go to slide 18, Ross. So after the conclusion of the siege, Stirling is occupied by Cromwell's troops, and we have actually all sorts of interesting things here. We have Guthrie, who is actively preaching and going against the Cromwellian regime. Cromwell describes him as the small man who wouldn't bend. He's depulled from his congregation in the Church of the Holy Rood. He's actually thrown out by a mob. He may be chased down the hill with stones, and there are often claimed to be some blood marks on houses where he sheltered, at least into the 19th century, early 20th century. We're going to come back to him a little bit later. Now, because he was deposed and he was replaced by his assistant, who, oh goodness me, I've now forgotten his assistant minister. Sorry. Right, we'll go on to slide 19, please. So slide 19. Right towards the end of the Cromwellian regime, there is Stirling's bit of a witch trial, March 1659. Now, the Guthrie doesn't take part in this trial because he's been deposed. It's his assistant that does this, along with the provost and other leading politicians. Right. Interestingly enough, during the Cromwellian occupation of Stirling, the amount of witch trials actually falls in half. And in Stirling, there had always been an understanding that witch accusations could be malicious, and there were more trials for false accusations of witchcraft than for witchcraft. Now, James VI had made this popular. It was an elite pursuit. The king, the head of state, believes in witches, and therefore witches are real. Matthias Simpson, sorry, that's his name. That's the minister who takes over from Guthrie. Matthias Simpson. So Matthias Simpson is the minister in Stirling's biggest ever witch trial, which takes place in the Tolbooth. Now, not the current Tolbooth as pictured, but the immediate predecessor. So this involved a dozen or so people. Lots of people are found guilty. Lots of people are found innocent. One person is definitely executed. One Bessie Stevenson. Bessie Stevenson appears to be a folk charmer, a folk healer. And she confesses to performing an act of witchcraft in the Well Green Well. And what this seems to have involved is taking the clothes of a sick person, washing them in the well, walking anti-clockwise with them, taking the disease, so the disease transfers onto the clothes, then into herself, and then she was going to cast it someone else. And she seems to have done a few other things as well. Her confession. There is a Scottish witch datus which records all confessions and all accused. So Bessie Stevenson found guilty and executed, probably executed outside Stirling at Tolbooth. Most witches are strangled, some are burnt. There's some accounts of witches being burnt in the valley before it became a cemetery. Now, I think it's necessary to expand a little bit about witches and witchcraft. So there is obviously, and I, for the record, I don't believe in witchcraft, but there are two different types of witches. There are healers, people who practice sympathetic magic in healing, and then there is witches. Witches, let's call them enemies of God, enemies of society. The witches from Macbeth, who are interested in the overthrow of order society. So if you think about the second category of witch, the best way to think about those are some weird hybrid between a paedophile, a terrorist, the most despicable individuals that you could possibly think of. That's who 17th century witches were thought to be. Macbeth are the witches in people's minds, and that's why society was so keen to be rid of them. Now, in Bessie Stevenson's case, she may have been a faith healer. She may have been mentally ill. She's clearly on the margins of society. And here's one of the things: if you are accused of witchcraft, the best thing to do is to get your wealthy relatives to protest and get you released. You can protest your innocence. You have to protest your innocence. If you confess everything, but the process. So first of all, you are your hair is cut off, your clothes are taken off, and you're kept awake. If you don't confess at that point, a prick is brought out, and you are pricked across your body until there is a spot where no blood is released, you feel no pain. That's the point where the devil touched you to seal your compact. So you're a witch. So the next stage is to save your soul, to get you to confess, see if you implicate anyone, and move on. So definitely a witch hunt. And unfortunately for us, unfortunately for Bessie, she is found guilty and executed. All rather depressing, really. Right, I'm going to move on because I realise I've actually talked slightly longer than I thought I would. Slide 20, please, Ross. So, the Restoration. We have Charles II, who is extremely high church Anglican, believes in bishops, imposes bishops on Scotland. We have Bishop Leighton in Dunblane, famously constructed the library, the oldest purpose-built library in Scotland. He ups the ante on everything. So Cromwell, for example, complained about Guthrie. Charles II orders his execution. If we go to slide 21, please, Ross. So yes, here we have Guthrie's execution in Edinburgh. The head was on a pike for the next 20 years. Guthrie is first minister of around 100 to be executed by the state. The repressions are actually very, very extreme. Famously, the Solway martyrs, two young women who refused to accept the authority of bishops, were tied to stakes in the low tide in Solway and left to drown. People were horrified by that. I'm horrified by that, but people were horrified by that at the time. I was actually so horrified I didn't actually believe this was real. So there is a gradual movement. You have things called conventicles, and you can have house conventicles or field conventicles, and these are religious worship, people following the covenant. So the covenanters, the conventicles, the whole thing connected. Slide 22, please, Ross. So we have field conventicles. There are a handful of these. There seems to be a batch round Pippin, out on the moors between the Glens Road and the Gun Club. There's one above Fintry, quite hidden. This mask here is Alexander Pedden's mask. It's real. This protected his identity when he preached to people in the public. The state wished to outlaw this worship, and people defended it with arms, and some of the conventicles are in a horrific period. Slide 23, please, Ross. We actually have some ministers who actually take up arms. This is James Ewer from the minister at Kippen, who took 200 men with him to the Battle of Bothwell Brig. The authorities arrested his wife, his son, his mother. His mother died being interrogated by the state. All rather harsh, actually. The Covenanters in the violent period actually gets worse under James II. James II is, of course, James VII in England, the last Catholic monarch in Britain. Slide 24, please, Ross. He is obviously deposed in what we call the Glorious Revolution, which leads to William of Orange, the Dutch-backed coup. Of course, we know where some of this goes. So we have slide 25. We have the Orange Lodge. We have Billy Boys, and we have the Hillbillies in America. And one of the things that we're looking at here is religious freedom being defended by the right to bear arms, and we can see this surviving in kind of American politics to this day, and we have some of the so-called Irish Scots, Ulster Scots. You read about the Ulster Scots in America, and actually their role in American history. So we move on to slide 26, please, Ross. Now, one of the things is that the politics of the 17th century carry forward through the 18th into the 19th century. And this inspiration in the 19th century finds its way into the Old Town Cemetery, into what we consider the empire to be. So we have Guthrie's statue, we have the Solway martyrs. The message that the Old Town Cemetery is communicating is that the empire is a good thing, that God is probably white, is probably Protestant, that it is the function of the empire to Christianize, to evangelicize for the empire. These trends obviously lead to the Indian, well, what we call the Indian Revolt, the Indian Mutiny. The Indians call the First War of Independence, and a very, very militant, muscular view of Christianity, that we're actually going to go out to the world and spread that particular message. And all of that begins in the 17th century. But I was going to say, ladies and gentlemen, I think I should draw a conclusion. It is a very complicated period. Of course, don't forget that James VII's grandson is Bonnie Prince Charlie, and he didn't go away until 74. So depending how you wish to view the Reformation or the Glorious Revolution, you're either looking at instability and civil war between 1560 and 1746, or 1689 and 1746. So it's either 100 odd years or 200 years. Anyway, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Are you going to open up to questions, Ross?
Yes.
Oh, there we go.
I'm taking my,
just all went silent.
yeah. I'm going to find myself. I put myself in too many boxes. But thank you very much, Murray. I really, everyone as well, we've really enjoyed that. I am going to, first of all, try and get everybody on to unmute. And if I can get a round of applause for Murray, would be great. Thank
you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's mute everybody again. So, yes. What we'll do is we'll go around the room. If anybody's got a question for Murray, if you can please raise your hand, and we'll go through to you, and we can ask you get you to ask your question. So, any questions, just raise your hand. This here, there. Jim, there we go.
Hello, Murray.
Hi, Jim.
Another Catholic question for you.
That's okay.
It seemed to me that in the Reformation, the power of women declined. John Knox, with his criticism of the monstrous regimen of women, and religious women at the time were running industrial agriculture complexes that were called abbeys. Women were in charge of guilds, and then all of a sudden that was taken away from them. The feast days that were attributable to women disappeared, so you didn't have your days off, thanks to that women's saint. And then women were hounded in Protestant lands for being witches. So it seems like women lost 200 years of progress all of a sudden. What do you think?
I would I'd cautiously agree. Not the first time it happens. It keeps coming back. There are, for example, in the the 6th and 7th centuries, 6th and 7th century Northumbria, there are enormous numbers of powerful women in, monasteries, abbeys, etc. They decline, and it comes and it goes. Definitely, there is a misogynistic strand through the Kirk. Certainly, that 17th century Kirk, which is rather depressing. I personally think Scotland became a poorer, darker, dimmer place than it was before, and I do wonder if, and perhaps it didn't come clear. I do think there is a particular strand of misogyny from James the Sixth, and all rather of course. It is honestly James the Seventh, James the Second, of course, is Catholic and is trying in the last gasps of his regime to introduce religious tolerance, i.e., to get Catholicism not to replace Protestantism, but to get a plurality of religion, and it is rejected by carefully coordinated. Exactly what's going on? Is it people backing? Is it English Protestants backing what's going on? Well, by that point, everything is tied up with international relations. But certainly, I think that I think Scotland became a poorer place, and my contrast is always with what happened in England. So the English Reformation involves the dissolution of the monasteries and the abbeys, but not the churches. In Scotland, we had our Reformation was more of a revolution, and we sacked everything. There is one bit of medieval stained glass left in Scotland, pre-Reformation glass, which is in the Cowgate in Edinburgh. What we lost.
One banner.
Yes.
Only one banner left.
So I think that society became the poorer. I think it became more misogynistic, but of course, it was the Reformation that allows James VI to become James I. That leads to the union of the parliaments, that leads to the Enlightenment, that leads to empire, that leads to Scotland having the impact that it has had on a global stage. And the question we face today is whether or not such, whether the game was worth the candle. But we're moving into politics.
The game is worth the candle, is for sure.
Yes, but yes. I won't go further because it's not a private chat.
No,
Murray, you mentioned early on.
One joke. Can we do jokes?
Sorry, we had two people there. Right, you want a joke, Jim?
No, I'm going to tell you one.
All right.
This horse goes into a bar. Lucky bastard.
Right.
That was from a mutual friend.
Very good.
Thank you very much, Jim. If I could get a show of hands, or if someone's got another question.
Yeah, it's David here.
Hi.
Hi, David.
Early on in your talk, you mentioned that the King James Bible obviously has his name on it, and he instigated the work of the scholars to put it together. And you mentioned there's one particular piece where it talks about shall not suffer witches, which was not how it was translated previously. So that's clearly seen to be a reference of James influencing that Bible personally. But do you know if there's anything more? Because it's come to light more recently that the King James Bible is about 80% William Tyndale's Bible.
Right. Well, we're one of the. I mean, my Bible. This specifically with the King James Bible. I'm less au fait with it. I do know that lots and lots of I mean, the history of the Bible, the history of the translations, everything is incredibly complex. Some of the original Hebrew discussions, when you actually go back to the Torah and then earlier versions of the Torah, God is described as both man and woman. There are all sorts of things within this. I mean, Dermot McCulloch is very good on the actual that very early history of the Bible, but there is an enormous amount of scholarship. One of the very interesting things is that Darwin was a Christian. So lots of people today, lots of atheists say that you can't be a Christian because Darwin proves that the evolution outweighs the Bible. But Darwin was a Christian, and Victorian Christians had a greater sophisticated understanding of the Bible than we currently do. And one has to be very, very careful about exactly what you read into the Bible. This has always been one of the mainstays of Catholic arguments against the Bible being in English, because you simply don't understand what you're reading. And one can, without going too complicated, the same thing happens with Islam. And you have to be careful that you have to understand the hadiths, and you have to read all the hadiths in order to understand the context for the sacred text that you read. So the same thing happens in the Bible, and we can read lots of things. So we know that kidnapping. No one talks about kidnapping in the Bible. Does that mean it's okay? What it means is that no one thought to discuss kidnapping. They also don't discuss cybercrime. So you have to understand the context of what you're reading, and you have to go back to as close a source as possible, unless you're going to go to the kind of the very broad generalities: love thy neighbor, do unto others, etc., etc. So the 10 Commandments are quite good, nice and easy, very understood. Jesus' teachings, very easy, understood. But you end up with all sorts of oddities. So the Galatians, for example, discusses whether Greek Christians need to become Jews before they become Christians. And if you're going to become a Jew, you need to be circumcised. So should Christians be circumcised? So there's all sorts of complexities in these things that you. The Bible should not be read lightly. Put it that way. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that, David and Murray. It's just, see when you're moving about, I think with your microphone on your headphones, it's catching on your hoodie and it's giving us a lot of crispy noise. Would you be able, I don't know, maybe to tuck it into your jumper a little bit? And that
I don't actually have what is it? These are my earphones.
Yeah, do they not have a microphone on attached to them? All right.
No, not at all.
Oh,
I don't know where the interference is coming from. I bought the speaker into the microphone. Sorry, Ross, I don't know.
Oh, that's fine. That's okay. No problem. So if I can see a hand then for another question for Murray. And got Jim King there.
Hello, Ross.
Hello.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks, Murray, for the lecture. It was very interesting. I was just wondering what you thought about one of the other more kind of cultural and consequences of James when he moved to England to take up the kind of joint crown.
which related also to subsequent publication of the King James Bible, which was written in English. And in addition to, you know, James and his entourage moving to London, but it was obviously 10 times bigger, it was, you know, vastly more wealthy, and it was a consequence of James wishing to fit in better there. You know, that it was the consequence of that was the decline of the Scots language. You know, with writing the Bible in English, it was English was seen as superior to Scots up until that time. You know, not only culturally but legally in Scotland, Scots and you know, was a language of court. It was a language of law. And you know, with the move to England of the court, you know, that was the beginning of the decline of Scots, which, you know, we're still suffering today, effectively.
Well, yes, but it starts earlier because Knox makes the decision to use an existing English Bible. And I mean, where do you go with this? That we started calling ourselves. We were around 1,000. We were the Gallic Kingdom of Alapa, around 1,200. So the later the Canmores are wish to be more clearly identified with England and France than they do with Scotland. That's why, you know, they have classical biblical English names. So, you know, Edgar, Alexander, David, Malcolm IV is the last Scottish king with a Gaelic name. William I is described as being French in a very complaining manner. Around 1200, we start calling ourselves Scotland because that's how it is. So the process of loss of the Scots language, the loss of identity, kind of kicks off from the very beginning of the nation. We're in bed with an elephant. We always have been. It's also worth pointing that lots of people argue that the fact that we speak English rather than Italian or Irish or Gaelic is one of the factors that leads to the success of the Scots through the empire. And to put it crudely, the Irish, so if you think about the Europeans, it's a racist society, it's a bigoted society. At the very top of this peak are the so-called WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The Scots fit in there. We are white, we are Protestant, and we speak English. The Irish are Catholic, and they don't often speak English. The Italians don't speak English and are Catholic. So we're actually able to operate in empire society in a way that benefits us. So, I mean, locally, Earthry Estate, where the university is, that's founded by the first Scot to operate in the East India Company. So the big question for us is for today's society is how did we benefit from things that we now perhaps are uncomfortable with? Certainly, there are people in Stirling that own slaves. There were people in Stirling that were compensated for slaves. We generally integrated the empire very well and financially very well out of it.
Thank you very much. I think I've seen a question there for Linda as well. See if yep. Oh wait, no. Sorry, I can't hear you there, Linda. Yeah. Well, if I can get another question, then and we'll come back to you, Linda. Oh wait. Oh wait, no, can you speak again?
Hello?
There we go. We got you.
Oh,
We got you.
okay. Hi, Murray. Thanks for the
Hello.
talk. It was really interesting. I hail from Kura's Palace. Whether we're getting back there or not, God only knows. But I'm interested in what you said about the witch trials. That in Stirling, more trials were being held about folk being accused of witchcraft than the actual witch trials themselves, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
I have known for a while that, or is it true, that families had to pay for their own members to be basically tortured. The pricking process and the actual witch, I don't know, trying to get the confession out of them was actually paid by the families. Is that true? And also, who paid for the trials? Because that must have been very expensive.
Right. Well, I have to say I'm not certain about the any of the financial implications. The place I would look is Enemies of God, which is the key modern text on the Scottish witch trials, and I'm trying to find out remind myself of the author, which I cannot now remember. But Enemies of God, it's out of print, but I happen to have a scanned PDF of it. Should anybody want it, I'm quite happy to circulate that. That is the kind of modern systematic account of the trials. I think that broadly, civic society would pay for the expenses. Certainly there are accounts of local communities, the church paying for witch prickers. It's a salaried position, a job. Obviously, the council here would pay for any expenses arising from the toll booth. I can certainly conceive that people would be fined, but when you actually go, the witch trial database, it's Edinburgh University's witch database, which lists all the trials. I've not, and there are financial fines, clearly, but I've not read of people having to pay for the material expenses of their prosecution. And certainly that's not something that exists in today's mechanism. And today's trial mechanism is the same as it was in the past. You certainly have to pay for your defense. And certainly you could, your conditions could be improved if you paid the jailer. That seems to be quite a commonplace thing. But yes, no, I can't. I'm not sure about that, I'm afraid.
Yeah. I heard that it can be a very lucrative thing for someone to be accused of witchcraft, and that they would have to pay for their own torture, basically, or their families would have to pay, and even for the pyre and the tar and the ropes and maybe the partial strangulation before they were burnt or whatever. And I heard that it could be up to 4 years' wages. But maybe that's just in places where they didn't really write things down.
Well, I mean,
off the record.
Yes, if generally accounts are the things that survive, so I would imagine that is quite easy to confirm. I think that generally the issue of more trials for false accusation. This is in a paper by a colleague of mine, John Harrison from Stirling, and it's called Women in the Branks. So if you look on John Harrison's website, you'll find the link, and he has the figures there. A lot of the, I mean, basically the classic witch trial is accusations that you end up, people are accused of doing various things, bits and pieces. When you actually drill right down into the details of the 59 trial, there's a guy accused of playing the pipe, a kind of, or a flute rather, and he gets off. So there's all sorts of people are dragged into these trials, and I mean, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. And certainly, if you had to pay for your own trial, that's even worse. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, sir. I think Jim Brumby then, go with you.
Okay.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Murray. My daughter actually went on a 10-week course to Edinburgh University, you know, and it was all about witches. That was years ago. Well, she was, you know. Anyway, Maggie's Wall, the stone monument up at Dunning, is probably the most famous monument that's been built or erected as a result of, you know, witchcraft. In Scotland, there's been 1,500 casualties, you know, people being prosecuted, mainly women. And really, what my daughter was saying to me is it's really the monarch working with government to establish, you know, laws, and most of the charges resulted from evidence given by the clergy against a person in their locality. For example, and visitors, you know, obviously there have been the Maggie Wall stone monument has become a shrine to some people, because to the visitors to the shrine were Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, the Moors murderers. Myra took a stone away with her, and she got a photograph taken at the monument with the word witches, I think it was above her shoulder or whatever. To me, I mean, it's just been people just sort of climb on their neighbours, just like the Russian, the Communist Party
Yes.
thing. You know, that's what I think has been. There's hardly anybody. It's impossible to say anybody's been a witch or practicing witch or whatever. They've just been doing what they've been believing in. You know, they've not been doing anything wrong or any harm, causing any harm to anybody else. So why on earth so many people are executed?
It's worth just pausing there, Jim. There are actually a handful of self-confessed witches who were genuinely, who confessed without torture to trying to do people harm. There are not many of them, and most of them fall into the category of, I think broadly there are probably three different types. There are folk healers who fall on the wrong side of someone. There are the mentally ill. There are clearly charlatans, people who are trying things on, but there is a very, very small minority of people who, my colleague Pam from the archives has this, and I can't quite remember, but I think there might be somebody from Kiffin or Gargunnock who actually genuinely believes they're a witch, and they've communed with Satan in order to get power, in order to sort people out. So there are enough of these people, and in a society that's scared, and in a society that the death of a cow is a major event. Certainly, some of the let's call them the good witches, for want of a better word, invoke passages from the Bible in their spells, and there's a belief that the passages from the Bible, that's good magic rather than bad magic. And as Jim Roach was saying way back when, there's a clear transition in society from a more a misogynistic tone that comes in, and women suffer the brunt of that. But there are evil people there are always evil people. And now, I should say, of course, yes, I don't believe in witchcraft, but that doesn't mean. But I believe that some people believe in witchcraft, and certainly some people absolutely positively believe they were communing with the devil in order to get even with their enemies.
Right.
And I just can't remember quite who Pam was talking about. But again, I suspect all of this is in Enemies of God, which is the key text. I was going to say, I noticed somebody asking for a copy of it. If anybody wants it, can they email me, cook@stirling.gov.uk. So cook@stirling.gov.uk. And I quite happily forward that on.
Okay.
Murray, I think we've got Helen
Thanks,
here, very eager to get a question in. So there you go, Helen.
Just to say, Enemies of God was written by Christina Larner, who
there you go, yes.
happens to be my sister, though unfortunately she died about 30 years ago. And she also wrote, what's this one called? Witchcraft and Religion, which is another interesting. So I would recommend my sister's books.
They are universally acknowledged as the key texts, and absolutely without doubt. And for want of a better word, witch studies wouldn't be where they are without those books. They are very good. And certainly that's the edition I have. Yes, very good, very good book. One of the interesting aside is that there has been recently a study on the content of witch confessions, and there seems to be this whole Stockholm syndrome thing emerging, where someone is being tortured. They are asked leading questions, and the nature of the confession reveals folk traditions. So people are being tortured, and they want the torture to end. So they discuss. So they're asked for details. So there's a point in witch confessions when the witch's Sabbath appears, and the witch's Sabbath appears at a certain date, as it is published as a concept in a book, and then it appears in the confessions because it appears in the leading questions. And when people describe the witch's Sabbath, they're describing Panther, for example, seen in the but they're filling the detail with memories of older Catholic ceremonies, of things that their stories their parents told them, their grandparents told them, and you have this fascinating, if horrific, window into a very, very different mindset. I mean, one might go as to draw attention to draw allusion to the waterboarding that the Americans undertook during the immediate aftermath of 9/11, which yielded no actionable intelligence, and hundreds of people tortured. It simply doesn't work. They just tell you whatever comes to their head.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions, Ross?
Yeah, sorry, I was just typing somebody back in the chat. Yeah, I think we've got Jim there. Thank you for that. Jim?
Again, Murray,
Hi, Jim.
in terms of the Scots language point, Archbishop Hamilton's catechism from the 1500s is reputed to be the finest written Scots document that exists. So folk might want to look that up online, and also to reflect that he was hanged in Stirling in his mass vestments, just to make the point.
Thanks, Jim. I mean, the passage of time diminishes these things, and it requires an act, quite a fierce act of imagination, to draw back to the depths of hate, the depths of faith, And presumably the Archbishop would be. Did he get beatified for that? Is that not the sort of thing?
He founded the Theological College in St Andrews, and clearly he was killed for his faith. At that level, he was a martyr. But the two kids that he'd had by his girlfriend were a bit of an issue.
I mean, yes, I don't want to quote Luther, "Here I stand, I can do no other," but I do sometimes think the church brought these things upon itself.
In terms of the Scots language point, I think as well, people should look out online his catechism, Archbishop Hamilton. He wanted it read
Hamilton's catechism.
People would understand the faith, and they wanted it read at Mass, and he founded the place in St Andrews because he wanted a better educated clergy.
Well, don't we all? Of course, I'm thinking about our Deacon friends, which was obviously the inspiration for their founding. And I've been reading about Alexander II, of course, who brings them to Scotland, and he has Clement of Dunblane, one of the very first Dominicans, who is instrumental in the beatification of Queen Margaret, but also gives Alexander rather poor advice, which leads to the aborted invasion of the Western Isles and the death of Alexander at Oban. And apparently, this is those in this intervention by St. Columba. The interesting thing is that 12 or 13 years later, at the Battle of Args, the divine inspiration this time on the side of the Scots. So I'm not sure my God chooses him over those 30 years. I'm going to Google Archbishop Hamilton's catechism. I'll put it up. Right. I'm going to put it up somewhere. I'll write about it. I'll bring it up. Right, though. Ross, is that your question? We go, yes?
Yes, I think
it comes up. I will publicise that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, not at all. Have we got any other questions around the room then? If I have a look around, no, I don't think so. Maybe just a wee last question for myself then, Murray. Say if people like Elizabeth had John Dee in her court advising alchemy and things of this nature, which are pretty synonymous with the craft, if you will. Was that still in the times Charles and writing his demonology, were there employed courts of, we would probably say, the dark arts back then, or did that come in later on?
Well, there are certainly people studying alchemy. So Damien de Falkis is in James IV's court. I don't think he's in James V's court. I think that the difficulty is that let's call them the natural sciences or alchemy isn't necessarily connected directly with the dark arts per se, so much as knowledge. I think the Reformation seems to crystallize people's views about what is a Christian act and what is not a Christian act. But yes, I cannot think of. Well, I suppose the person that springs to mind is not in the Scottish court, but is in one of the Italian courts, which is an ancestor of Walter Scott, Michael Scott, who's clearly a polymath, but was reputed in medieval Italy to be a sorcerer. which led to his inclusion in Dante's Inferno. In actual fact, the only Scot in hell, according to Dante, simply because the only Scot that Dante knew of. There you go. And you've gone, Ross. You've vanished.
Oh,
there we go.
Oh, it's
yeah, the screen went blank. I don't know if that was back to Jim. So we seem to have gone beyond 3, but I'm certainly happy to keep answering questions. I have also found Bishop Hamilton's catechism. So I'm going to see if I'll put that up.
Yes, yeah, I've set it so anyone can share. Are you wanting to share it on just now?
No, I can't. I can't do that simply because it's on my laptop rather than my. However, what I'll do is I'll put the link on Facebook. But simply, all you have to do is the formal title is "The Catechism Set Forth by Archbishop Hamilton, printed at St Andrews, 1551, together with the Two Penny Faith." This is a Victorian version of it, which has been scanned in by something called the Internet Archive, and I'm currently looking at PDFs which I can flick, and I do the same simply to oh, yes, there we go. It's lovely actually, and the document actually reprints the kind of medieval. I suppose I could take a picture. Could I take a picture of it? I don't know. I could turn it around. If I turn it around, there we go. I don't know if people can and see. This is a very good. It's an American university that's scanned in lots of out-of-print books. Obviously, everything's reprinted in the Victorian era. And there is no shortage of these books. Internet Archive, all you have to do is Google the title of the book, and then I tend to put text next to it. And this is an 1882 version printed by the Church of Scotland, and it's completely free. It's a brilliant resource.
And it's free. What better price for a Scotsman?
And it's free. It's free. Yes.
Right, fantastic. Well, I think that's us there for questions, buddy. So what I'll do again, just like we did before, for everybody that's still here, I'm going to unmute everybody. If we can put our hands together to give Murray a round of applause.
Thank you very much, everyone.
So we'll leave it there, and thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Have a great
weekend. Ross, thank you very much.
Thank you, Murray.
Bye for now. Bye.
Bye.